Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our panel, Translation Matters. And we have an excellent lineup immediately of writers, translators, and publishers. And you'll notice I use the plural because we have multiples of each. To my immediate left is Colin Jordan, who in 2010, Colin founded Seven Vientos, or 7V, which is an independent publishing company in Chicago. Since then, 7V has published 3 books, with the 4th slated for release in March 2014. 2 of these books, Saturnalia and the illustrated biography of Mishima, were translated by Jordan from Spanish into English himself. He's been a lifelong speaker and student of Spanish. To Jordan's left, we have Cristina Garcia. She is the author of 6 novels: The King of Cuba, The Lady Matador's Hotel, A Handbook to Luck, Monkey Hunting, The Aguero Sisters, and Dreaming in Cuban. She's also edited 2 anthologies, Bordering Fires, the vintage book of contemporary Mexican and Chicano literature, and Cubanismo, the vintage book of contemporary Cuban literature. And she has also written 3 works for young readers: Dreams of Significant Girls, The Dog Who Loved the Moon, and I Want to Be Your Shoebox. She's also published a collection of poetry, The Lesser Tragedy of Death. To Christina's left, we have Achi Obejas, born in Cuba and moved to the U.S. when she was 6. Her newest work, an anthology of recent immigrant fiction called Immigrant Voices, 21st Century Stories, will be released this month by the Great Books Foundation. Her most recent books are Ruins, a novel, Ruins. And This Is What Happened in Our Other Life, which is a best-selling poetry chapbook. She's the translator of Junot Diaz's The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wu and This Is How You Lose Her, both from English into Spanish, among many others. She was part of the Chicago Tribune Pulitzer Prize-winning team in 2001, has won several journalism honors, 2 Lambda Literary Awards, and an NEA Poetry Fellowship. She has published articles in many periodicals, including a regular column in These Times, and she's currently a distinguished visiting writer at Mills College in California. And to Achi's left, we have Valeria Luiselli, born in Mexico City in 1983, grew up in South Africa. Her work, novels and essays, has been translated into many languages, and she's published in places including the New York Times, Granta, and McSweeney's. Some of her recent projects include a ballet libretto for the choreographer Christopher Wheeldon, performed by the New York City Ballet, a pedestrian sound installation for the Serpentine Gallery in London, and a novella in installments for workers in a juice factory in Mexico. And she lives in New York City. So, and I am, as John said, Susan Harris, the editorial director of Words Without Borders. Wordswithoutborders.org is an online literary magazine of literature from all languages translated into English. We're in our 11th anniversary. We're in our 11th year. We've published monthly. Everything that we've published is online in our archives and free. To date, we've published around 1,800 pieces, translated from 121 languages, written by authors from 128 countries. So obviously translation is very important to me, and I think of it from an editorial and a publishing perspective, and also, of course, from a reader's perspective. But I thought that before we talked about why translation matters, we could each talk a bit about what exactly translation means to each of us and why, in turn, it matters. So, Colin, would you like to lead off?
Sure, thank you. Translation to me is a necessary part of writing, or reading, really. It's without it, we would have such a limited view of our world and the people who live in it. I mean, without we can still hear me. Without translation, we wouldn't be able to read Tolstoy, which is an important writer in general in the world. There's no, and without learning all the languages that exist, there's no way that we'd be able to have that kind of richness of experience in our lives. And it's what connects us to each other and makes our lives richer.
Well, I don't know. I think language in and of itself is an act of translation, because with language you're trying to capture something really essentially uncapturable. You're trying to distill, action, emotion, history, whatever it is with language. So it gets all the more complicated when you're moving from one language to another and trying to contextualize that culturally as well. So for me, it's something we do every day, trying to capture experience.
Long before I was translating anything professionally, I used to translate for fun. I used to just translate to see what would come of actually making that transference that you're talking about, and just sort of seeing, what got lost, what got enhanced, what played well with others and what didn't. And for me, it was almost, a spiritual practice. Part of what I do every day when I write, is read poetry, and then the other part is maybe translate, something very, very short, a few lines, usually poetry, although most of my translating work is in prose. But I think of it as part of my practice of just sort of being with words, being a writer. That's what I do.
Well, hi, good night, or good afternoon. I don't know, I think that in the 19th century, like in the mid-19th century, it was the German linguistic philosophers who were asking themselves this question. So it's sort of about time that we start asking this question more insistently in this part of the world. I think that it was before any other country, Germany, that started really becoming preoccupied with why translation matters. And I think the answer today is no different to the answer that they gave more than 150 years ago, which is basically that a language that does not let itself be contaminated by others does not evolve and does not change, and therefore becomes stale and dies. No? So what I think is most important about translation is that the capacity to be porous as a language and to allow foreign languages to enrich your own. And I guess that's my concern mostly as a writer, but I guess also as a reader, I have a more selfish relationship to translation, and it goes more in the direction of what you were saying, which is basically that there's 6,500 languages in the world. I know I can read 4, maybe 5, and no more. So without translation, I mean, we're basically stuck.
And it would be a terrible loss, I think, to be limited to only the literature written in languages that one could read, even if one is as talented as you are, Valeria, and have 4 or 5 at your disposal. I think another reason that translation is so crucial is that in this part of the world, in the U.S. in particular, we know so many other countries through a strictly political prism. We know very little about the everyday about the culture, about the art, about the writing of countries such as, again, if we think of the axis of evil, the 7 countries that made up that group that Bush categorized. I think that we would all agree that literature is an ideal way it's an ideal entree into a culture to see what people think about, what people care about, and what a country really consists of, what a country is, beyond the simple facts of, say, politics and battle positions. I think that literature is crucial for that. And again, I think that translation, bringing work in and out of English into languages that people can read, is absolutely crucial for that. All four of you are bilingual Spanish-English, and all four of you live to some degree between languages and in both languages. How do you find that affects your work as a writer? Valeria, what do you think?
Well, I don't know. I can't, they say fish don't see the water, so I'm not sure how it affects.
A little bit, because it's, I don't know, I can't
You can't hear me? No. I can hear myself so loud, so I don't know. Can you hear?
the microphone a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, so if I speak like this, you can still hear me? Okay. So? What do we do? So I was saying, fish can't see the water, so I'm not sure. I don't know any other way, so I'm not sure if I can say how it affects my writing, having grown in a multilingual environment. No, I learned English as a second language in a way, because I moved to South Korea when I was 6 years old, and I learned English in an American school there. It was like a Korean-American school. And but I learned how to write and read there. So I learned how to write and read in English before I started doing it in Spanish. So somehow my relationship to writing and reading is closer, or just more. Or English is more of an immediate language for me in that sense. Although maybe speaking feels more awkward in English than it does in Spanish, and writing doesn't. And so what does happen is that my 3 published books are originally written in Spanish, but really not so originally written in Spanish, because I always write bits and pieces in English that I then translate into Spanish or rewrite into Spanish. And so the process is very hybrid. The result is always monolingual or somehow monolingual, but the process is always bilingual.
Achi, I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I do that too quite a bit, where certain things just come in one language, and so I just leave them alone on the first draft, and then I worry about it later and come back to it and fix it. In my case, I'm writing in a primarily English way, and the stuff that is coming to me in Spanish is either speech or very specifically cultural things. Usually I hear people talk in Spanish, and then I bring them into English for the sake of the publication that I'm, that I'm imagining, usually a US-based publication. But I did have the experience when I was in Cuba for extended periods that my brain would just switch channels completely, and then it would work the other way around, where the stuff was coming in Spanish and the speech was really screwed up and coming in English. And I don't know why it worked that way, but I actually have a number of stories that have been published in the last few years that were almost entirely written in Spanish. In fact, more in Spanish than the way I normally write in English, which was really interesting and curious to me. And one of the editors actually insisted on there being a tagline that says "translated by the author," which I thought was really hilarious. But I kind of hear what you mean about that.
And of course, an author would not translate in this, or let me back up. You were not necessarily translating in the sense that you were taking a finished text and then rendering it in the second language. You were, alchemy performed by the author. I don't know how you would credit that properly, but and Christina, you as well.
Yeah, what Achi just described, although my Spanish, or I don't think my English is as good as Achi's either.
Oh, come on.
But no, I mean, you're constantly negotiating languages, I think. You're going back and forth, crisscrossing. A lot of my work, even though it's technically in English, I want you to be experiencing it in Spanish. Spanish comes through literally, I think, sometimes in the actual language, but sometimes more in the music and syncopation of the English. You know, so you're reading it in English, but somehow still having the experience, being reminded that this is not taking place in English, it's taking place in Spanish. So.
Colin, what Christina has just described is a huge part of the translator's task, of letting the reader read the translation in the target language and still sense and feel the source language. How do you handle that challenge? What kind of things have you done?
It is a challenge for sure. I've translated so far the 2 books that have been published by Siete Vientos, and they were both very different experiences. And I do, even though I don't look like I should, I do speak Spanish. I do write in Spanish, and I also translate. And so I find myself living between those worlds. I mean, I speak Spanish at home, and so I'm constantly negotiating that. And so it was actually really nice to be able to sort of share that with others. It's one of the things that I haven't been able to share with a lot of my family, with a lot of my friends, is that living in 2 worlds and sort of sharing those, even if it's just music. Like, hey, you might like this beat, but I can't share what it means. I can't share the lyrics with you. So I love that in translation I can try to do that, and I can use my voice as much as I can without sort of overpowering the author's voice. So I've done things like, I've noticed that the first draft is usually completely wrong in translation, because you're grabbing the first thing that comes to mind, and it's not always the right thing, but it made sense to me. For example, there was a line in Saturnario that I grabbed that was, that made no sense in Spanish. Even I've asked lots of people, and no one understands it, which is kind of great. I love that about Ray's writing. And it's this phrase that's, que ni en los centros espiritistas. It's basically, get rid of this guy, and then this little phrase. And it doesn't really, there's no translation for it in English. So it's a question of bringing that idea into, there's no context for it. So it's bringing it into a context that people can understand in English that isn't literal, but that still gives you that sense of something like, that gives you the sense that the language is there and that the rhythm is there. Yeah.
May I interject? Colin, do you have, because I know you're married to a Dominican woman, do you have any children yet together? No.
The due date's tomorrow.
Seriously? Oh my God! Congratulations! How did I know this? No, I asked.
She's here.
That's so exciting. Hi, congratulations. Felicidades. Do you have names picked out yet? Do you have a name picked out? No. Oh, okay. This is so exciting. Wow. Okay. All right. Well, I bring it up because that makes all of us who have children and trying to figure out. Achi has a 2-year-old. Valeria has a 4-year-old, and I have a 21-year-old. And now we have another one, just -0 at this point. But I thought it might be interesting to talk, as we were talking a little bit earlier, of like how we figure out the Spanish with our kids and how difficult that is in growing up in the States. And it might be something also that the audience can relate to when you're trying to, raise kids bilingually and so on. Anyway, I just thought.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we were speaking about this earlier also with Susan, who was asking, she was asking me if my case was that of many others, which is that Spanish was sort of like the language that was spoken at home, and then English was sort of the public language, which is a very common case here. And I said, yes, that was exactly my case, except now that my 4-year-old is in school and growing up in Harlem, in New York, she comes back and speaks to us in English, in her very particular Harlem English. So it's more like, whoa, whoa, mama, slow down. She says these sort of things to me. And so now, somehow the English has been transported into my private sphere, and it never had it was never a private reality for me, and now it is completely, and that does determine a very different relationship to the language. And I could say now that like my daughter tongue is English. Now I'm relearning a lot of words through her, words that are as simple as pocket or firefighter, or words that didn't have that gleam, that didn't have that peculiar intensity that they do have for people who speak the language, for native speakers of the language, and that somehow now I understand as a native speaker vicariously through my kid, and maybe it's because of that reason that now for the first time I am writing a novel directly in English, and knowing that it's going to be a novel written in English. And I mean, it could I don't know. That's a reason I could give for it. Although who knows? Maybe it's not my daughter. Maybe it's just other circumstances.
I was just going to say, I love that notion of language having a gleam. Like certain things. For me, certainly Spanish has that. Particular words, things from my childhood. Many food groups, like tostones has a big gleam for me. So that's, I like that notion of things having a particular shine attached to experience, attached to childhood or whatever. But sorry, you were going to say.
No, but we're good.
Just jumped right in. So, take it away.
No, I was going to say, I think it matters, at least for me, a whole lot, how my private life is playing out in terms of like the language that we speak at home. I think my Spanish has never been better than when I'm paired with a native speaker. I spent 8 years of my life with somebody who was Spanish dominant, and I think that really shifted it's a seismic shift for me in terms of language. And I don't think that I was fully bilingual actually at that time. I think I was casually bilingual, if you understand what I mean. Tanya, yeah, and then those 8 years with Tanya, man. Yeah, because everything was happening in Spanish. The most intimate stuff was happening in Spanish, the most public stuff was happening in Spanish, political problems were happening in Spanish, arguments were happening in Spanish, love was happening in Spanish, absolutely banal stuff like cleaning the bathroom was happening in Spanish, and getting on the bus was happening in Spanish. And I think that really made a difference. My partner now is American, but is bilingual, is fully bilingual, and she's one of those rare Americans who understands Cubans immediately. Like when we went to Cuba, she didn't take more than a day to figure it out. I was like, whoa, who are you?
She made through.
Yeah, you are my person. Yes, you are my soulmate. But the thing is that we, as a relationship, default to English. And so when we try to speak in Spanish with Ilan, there is something sort of unnatural about the effort. I don't know, you were paired with non-Latinos for most of your life.
Yeah, no, I mean, my daughter now corrects my Spanish because she's actually studied Spanish, and she takes Spanish literature classes at college just for fun. She took a whole Garcia Marquez class, and I tried to keep up with her in Spanish. She left me in the dust, and she's always correcting my subjunctive. It's very embarrassing at this point because she had Spanish. It was around. It was grandparents. It was in the neighborhood. We grew up in Los Angeles, but she herself took it upon herself to really study it and learn it. And my disadvantage was that I kind of took it for granted. It was a kind of kitchen Spanish, house Spanish. I always could get by with it, and so now as
I think it really there's something about having that intimate relationship with the language that changes things. So, I was doing translation before before Tanya, BT and AT, but mostly into English because English was a more comfortable place to land in terms of confidence about playing with language, about breaking rules in English, about doing that kind of thing. I mean, I think you need to have a lot of swagger swagger to do certain kinds of translation. I don't think that if I had not spent those 8 years of training, that I would have been able to translate Juno into Spanish, because that required a real sort of, not just knowledge of Spanish, but just a real, yeah, this is Play-Doh. I can do this with this, you know, and that wouldn't have come without that kind of intensity, intimate intensity with the language.
There's definitely something about that sort of very intimate relationship with the language. I mean, I've said before that it's, I spent a lot of time in the Dominican Republic, and I met my wife in the Dominican Republic, and I worked there and lived there, and like you were saying, all the banal stuff and all the really important stuff was all happening in Spanish, in Dominican Spanish, which is very interesting. And it was very new for me, because I had not been exposed to that. I grew up in Chicago, and I had a lot of I had people who, through my life, was either Argentinians or my first teacher was Nicaraguan. But for the most part, being in Chicago, it's like sort of a Mexican cadence that you get used to. So going to the Dominican Republic was very interesting. But I realized when I was either talking to friends or writing about my experiences at the time that it was so much easier to do that in Spanish because your brain's just working that way. And trying to just find the same idea, the same thought, or a similar word in English was a lot harder. So, especially with my friends who are bilingual, I would wind up just writing an email in Spanish because it was easier. And I think that really affects the way that I write. I don't write a lot of stuff that I've published yet, but that affects a lot of the way that I write. The things that I find interesting in a certain language tend to stay in that language, or at least, like you were saying before, get written initially in that language. And some words just stay there because there is no good translation for them, or no accurate translation for them that still has the same impact.
Although I think choosing those words is really important, because the words have to make sense contextually. You have to, you know, some words really don't translate, and you still have to make it work. You still have to translate them, because if they're not popularly known, if they don't work in context, you're still stuck
Can you give
translating.
an example of that? Like you were mentioning kitsch before in the room. What do you do with that?
Well, the word that we were actually translating from the Spanish is cursi, which actually is a very complicated word, because it can be camp, it can be kitsch, and it can be sentimental, and it depends on context. You know, because you can't have kitschy emotions, but you can have cursi emotions, you know? And so it becomes a really complicated mess, you know, this word that is just, again, you know, this very flexible term, you know? And I'm working on something that I'm not really allowed to talk about too much in public, but suffice it to say that it's a very big deal Cuban author, and the text is very complicated, and there's a lot of punning going on, and you know, a lot of wordplay, which is a nightmare. And the executor of this guy's estate, who is overseeing it, you know, is expecting a kind of an almost literal translation, which is particularly difficult when you're talking about wordplay and punning and multi-level, you know, conversations. I mean, and this came up because I said I actually had a 3-hour conversation, or, you know, hour and a half conversation, whatever it was, with this person about this one word, because I was kind of hoping in this particular instance to use kitsch, and this individual wanted the word camp, and I had to explain that camp actually has a kind of a gay, you know, underlayer there, and her macho Cuban writer would not fit this particular thing. And I mean, it was a
Did you get homicidal?
I've hung up on this person just raging at different points, especially because I'm required to be on exquisitely good behavior through all of these conversations, you know. So
That's just too tall an order, Achi. I mean, I think you gotta like put in the contract.
I think I'm on a loss level at this with this translation.
I think, Valeria, you've had, I think, a more harmonious experience with your translator, Christina McSweeney. Did you want to describe how that works?
Yeah, well, I guess...
Just for the counterbalance to Achi's
Yeah, it's sort of the
That's just my recent one.
Yeah, my experience with Christina McSweeney, who's a brilliant translator, was sort of the opposite. No? There has been it's been a long relationship. She's translated my 3 books, and from the first book, I actually wrote to her today and I asked her, how long did we take? Because we're going to be in a panel on translation, and I might end up speaking about this. So I wrote to her today and I asked her, how long did we take with the first novel? And she wrote back saying, I just saw my archives and we took 11 months to translate the first novel, which means that I took longer to translate the novel with her than I did to actually write it. Although I mean, usually I take notes for 2 years and read a lot, and then my writing process is very short. And so, but the translation process was much longer, and partly it was much longer than the writing process because she really let me rewrite a lot. So I would read her translation, and it was a very good translation. She used words that I would never come up with, for example, that aren't there immediately in my mind. But at the same time, I felt that her voice was very much not my voice, and I have a voice in English. I think in English sometimes, so there were certain things that didn't sound right, or especially that I realized were not that good, when I'm not good in any version, original and not. No? So I think that translation for me has become like a filter for bullshit, basically. You know, I realize where I bullshitted if it doesn't come out well in translation. So I used translation in that case, and now I do so more consciously as a filter for that. And so that's why we took so long. I basically rewrote the novel. No? The novel has different characters in English. It's very. I mean, there's something that's the same, but it's very different.
Colin, and you had mentioned that you were friends with Ray before you took on his translation.
Yeah, we were friendly. We had known each other. We had started to know each other, and it was actually the first book that we published that got him interested in publishing with us. And it was through the process of translation that we sort of became friends and became, I don't know, it's almost like we got a chance to see each other in a different light. Which sounds a little strange, but it was an interesting process because I would often go to him with these questions, and his first response was always, "It's your book. It's you just do whatever you need to do with it. It's your book." And I do think that it is a very different book than what it is in Spanish. And I did my best to keep it in his voice and to keep it as close as I could. But at the same time, you need to sort of tear apart the original to get at what it's really saying and to bring it to life in a new language in a way that makes sense, in a way that is true to it, because a literal translation of any text is never going to be a true translation. It does not work. And so Ray and I have become really good friends through that process. It was a lot. We'd get together and have a beer, and I'd ask him some questions, and he'd try to explain it to me as best he could, which was a lot of fun. Some of the stuff that he came up with were things that he heard from his mom, and his mom has not lived in the Dominican Republic in a long time, and things that he'd hear from her that he was bringing in that might have just been family sayings that weren't really accepted canonized Spanish, but to use those things and then to try to find an equivalent in English and try to get something that feels like you don't really know, but it sort of works and you understand it, but it gives you that same reaction you would get when reading the Spanish is sort of was a lot of fun. I love that sort of puzzle aspect of it.
Can I say something just quickly in response to that? The thing is, what I think is very interesting with Spanish is that there is no such thing as a canonized Spanish, even though in Spanish, which in contrast to English, does have a centralized organ, the RAE, the Real Academia del Español, which is really a group of old people who decide what is Spanish and what is not.
Old Spanish white guys.
Yeah, Spanish white guys, basically. I think there's one woman or two maybe, but they decide, that they decide what is and what isn't. But of course, that existing, nobody pays any attention to it. So Spanish.
Some editors do.
Some editors do, I guess, but not so much in Latin America, I would say, or less and less in Latin America.
Well, less so, although my second novel was translated here and then sent to Spain, and then we got the word that it was unintelligible Spanish, and so they retranslated it. And so there's two versions of the Agüero sisters in Spanish floating around, one by the Academy and then one for Latin America, for the rest of us,
So it was unintelligible according to the Spaniards? Well,
Yeah,
it
but
doesn't
this was in the
surprise me that
90s, so
in the 90s.
I mean, things have changed.
I think a lot of things have changed also because even just 10 years ago, or from 10 years back, there's more and more local publishing houses around the whole of Latin America. So it's not the big giants anymore, and you don't have to be translated or published in Spain in order to exist. And that has given Spanish in print the richness and diversity that it has in reality.
I think it also depends on, when you're translating, it depends a whole lot on the relationship with the writer. We're all talking really about sort of these close relationships with writers. Some writers don't want that,
And some are dead.
Well, even some that are alive. I mean, even
You have the widows to deal with,
absolutely.
which is worse.
Yeah, but I mean, some people, I translated Ana Lucia Portela and Wendy Guerra, both of whom are people I know and actually hang with and I'm friends with, and they both, independent of each other, made the decision that they did not want to participate in the translation unless I had a question. And, this is very, for me, familiar Havana Argot. I didn't really have any questions at all for Ana Lucia's book, which was not a particularly complicated story. I had maybe a couple of clarifications for Wendy. When I did Mexico City Noir, that was a different story. I had 15 stories, 15 different writers with 15 different sort of attitudes and voices. And more importantly, what was interesting to me, it was, maybe 10 of them said, "Go for it, babes. Grateful to you." And then the other 5 all presumed they spoke English, which is actually the worst of all situations. When the writer you're translating for does not actually speak the language that you're translating into, but thinks they know enough to have some say. And
It's like a nightmare scenario.
that is the worst case ever. I had one dude who said to me he didn't want me to use the word movie because it was too contemporary.
What?
And I was like, really? Because the word is from, the early part of the 20th century, moving pictures, movies. And he was like, no, that's too contemporary. I only want you to say cinema. We're going to the cinema. And I was like, that's never going to fly, but sure, whatever, that's the worst case scenario. That's the worst case scenario.
I really hope my translator doesn't say this about me.
Behind your back? Behind your back?
I had a very different experience with Belatin, with our second book, because and it was actually a much harder book to translate because it's so different. His sort of writing is so ambiguous. But I didn't have a relationship with him, and so when I was working on that book, it was sort of, all right, well, I'm going to use as many resources as I can, but I'm going to sort of try to stay out of his way. And when I met him, he said, I'm really surprised that you never emailed me or never tried to get in touch with me about it. I was like, because he said he has a standard list of just answers that he gives because he gets the same questions all the time, and so he has a standard list of answers, and there they are, and he was just going to give that to me, and that was going to be it. And he was like, yeah, I'm really surprised you never contacted me. I said, well, I hope you still like the translation. And but it was, a very different experience. So I can appreciate both. I hope I have a friend out of both of them, though.
Gunter Grass does one fabulous thing. He's done it a couple of times. He invites all of his translators, this was post-Nobel, he invites all of his translators to come to be his guest, and they spend a week together, and because all of the translators obviously have the German in common, The translators meet and talk with each other about how they handle different questions and different challenges in the text, which I think is great fun for the translators. I don't know how, and again, but the fact that Grass, again, was allowing the translators to collaborate with each other, but not necessarily controlling their results, I think was quite admirable. Again, authors who interfere are just the non-English reading author who feels that he or she should redo the translation is the nightmare. That is definitely the worst.
I don't have enough money to bring all my translators together or anything, but what did happen, and now it's easier. My translators do communicate with each other. One of them, the Italian, had like a blog where she was saying or writing and recording her experiences, and then Christina Maxwini, the translator into English, somehow found her blog. I don't know how she found it, and they started writing to each other. And then in the novel particularly, there's one translation that's very difficult because it's a phonetic translation of a poem that's originally in English, and each translator had to find a phonetic way of translating it into their own language. And the Italian translator had really good ideas, and her translation was much better than my original translation into phonetic English. So her translation ended up being like the staple translation that other translators used, for example. And that's good because they communicated with each other.
Yeah, when I was translating Juno's Oscar Wilde, it was fascinating because Juno had actually gathered together 16 of his best friends into an email group, and I would finish a chapter, send it to him. He would send it out to the 16 pals, the clan, and they would respond. And the notes would actually contradict each other. I'd get a note from somebody that would say, "This is perfect, this is ideal, I love this," and the next, literally like the very next email would be somebody saying, "Well, clearly you're just showing off your Cuban stuff here. This doesn't sound Dominican at all," and because there was a lot of hostility around that. And so there was all this stuff that was going on. But the really weird thing that happened is that while I was translating it into Spanish, everybody in the world was also translating it. And a lot of the other translators who were working off the English could function somewhat in Spanish, and they began to use the Spanish as a kind of just a point of comparison. And in the meantime, we started writing to each other. Soon it became like the translators support group, the Juno translators support group, where everybody it had nothing to do, there was no language that was serving as a spine anymore. Everybody was just kind of, sharing all their little tricks and stuff. But really, literally, we had like the Finnish translator with whom, nobody had anything in common, and, a bunch of people were doing it together. By the time we got to This Is How You Lose Her, I was able to lay down some rules and say...
I know that I'm not the moderator, Susan, but can I ask you a question about it?
Sure.
I've always joked, and not with Spanish writers, that Juno's books cannot be translated into Spanish. Well, the only
you obviously haven't read my magnificent translation.
I know I haven't. So I mean, now that you're here sitting, like, how do you translate, or what do you do with the bilingual aspect of it? Like, how do you bring that into Spanish?
There's this myth that he's writing a bilingual book. He's not. He's writing a book in English.
Okay, that's
and the Spanish only constitute about 18% of Oscar Wilde, and only about 8% of This Is How You Lose Her. There's actually very little Spanish.
So it is a myth, yeah.
And the thing is, he makes the English sound like Spanish. Syntactically, he's using English in ways that gives you the feel that he's writing in Spanish. And so when you read the book and you run into 2 words in Spanish, you feel like, oh my God, I just read a whole paragraph in Spanish. And you feel particularly empowered, like you now can really understand Spanish really well. That's not what's going on. The choices with Juno are not are not about that precisely, but rather what you will keep in English. Those are the choices that you have to make, because then you have to talk about context and stuff like that. But for the second translation, I just said, you, me, when I'm done.
Yeah.
And he said, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that again. So that was, the first book took a year and a half, the second book took 6 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And on the, I think this idea of what we keep in English is, I think, a great one to close this panel on, or close our comments on anyway, and to open the floor to your questions for our panelists. Yes.
Today, Random House, Penguin Random House announced that they're buying out Hawaii from Spain, which is going around social media and creating a lot of comment. And this is probably a fair question because this just happened, but I wonder what your thoughts are on what this agglomeration of publishing houses into 1 or 2 or 3 huge editorial groups can have on translation.
Well,
On the need to translate authors that may fall outside of the mainstream.
well, I think it's important. It is big news. I think it's important to remember that almost all of American publishing is controlled by 2 German companies. And that has affected translation publishing, I think, not so much on the theoretical, philosophical side, but as with everything else in publishing, on the financial. I think certainly other cultures, we were talking about this earlier, other cultures are much more receptive to work in translation than the U.S. market is. So that's one quick thought. What do you?
Well, the acquisition of Alfaguara may mean that they're actually going to translate some of those books that they wouldn't ordinarily do. But I generally am very nervous about the sort of the monster and how it grows. I think personal relationships with editors are very important. I had a book published by Random House, Days of Awe came out by him, and I swear to God, my publicist was like 12 years old, and I spent a lot of time sort of educating her about stuff that I was like, I'm sorry, isn't this your job? And that was terrifying to me. I was very lucky that I had a real old-time, editor at Random House, somebody who'd been around for a long time and was a vice president at Random House, Leona Nevler. So I feel like that experience for me was probably a little bit atypical. But the relationship with the house, where you had to talk to 16 people before you could get an answer to a simple question, never a good idea.
Just like Juno's group, see, it's the number is haunting you.
16 people. Oh, yeah, that is, yeah.
We also run the risk of having essentially this with all of the consolidation. Then anything that isn't mainstream then gets pushed aside even further. I mean, there's already this sort of kind of club that's hard to break into, and then you wind up with consolidating even more into a giant corporation that's now, that's even more than worldwide. I don't know what that would be. It's gigantic anyway, and so then you have it's more, the margins get smaller and smaller for the other writers.
Yeah, and just to amplify on that too, that my experience now is that with these ever-growing monoliths, publishing monoliths, that everything's done by committee. You don't have that individual editor sticking his or her neck out for a book he or she believes in. Right now, everyone has to agree. Well, what happens when everyone agrees? Mediocrity, for the most part. So I think there's an issue there as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you both are saying, the three of you. Practically all the publishing houses where I'm translated or where I publish also in Spanish are relatively small publishing houses, serious, very literary, but it's a team of people that I get to know personally and that I work with personally. And actually my only bad experiencing in publishing experiences with a big publishing house, and as you were saying too. So I think...
Except that they paid me a phenomenal phenomenal amount of money.
And they didn't pay me a phenomenal amount, because if you write in Spanish, the advances are really small, always. So, but what I do think is that what happens, or what a lot of writers may think, I think, is that if you want to carry on writing, you're a serious writer, and what you're interested in is your books being published and throughout your life, and to have a relationship with your editors where you can grow as a writer as they grow as a publishing house, then I think a lot of writers choose to stay in smaller publishing houses and not in these big giants.
Right, you do get the trade-off of, at the smaller independent houses, you might have a publicist who's 15 instead of 12, but you do. But as Valeria says, you have maybe perhaps fewer resources, but more attention from those resources. I think, which is, I think the future ways that things are going. Yes.
Since reading in English and reading in Spanish, applying the translated words, especially for some of these Hungarian writers and a lot of Latin American writers, just they get fucking messy. It's nice. They have this allowance where the syncopations are pages long. There's a beauty to it. And I find that I'm mainly reading a lot of English for the sake of it being, like you guys were saying, so committee, sweet, concise, clear. Bow tie. I'm finding as readers, I'm interested in you guys as readers. Do you find that tension, and where do you naturally lean towards?
Many writers in Spanish write in a typically English syntax, such as Borges. And so it's not, I think languages are you can mold them into anything really. And there's nothing inherent in how they're written really. But I do think that there's a stronger presence of the editor in the English language literary culture. And that's not bad, that's very good, but sometimes that implies that there's a homogenization in the way things are published. So, I mean, what my experience as a reader of just journals and newspapers, especially not really books, but journals, is that everyone sounds alike. There's like, it's as if like there was one editor that edited, or that editors edited with similar criteria. So everything sounds somehow similar. Of course, there are voices that really, really stand out. So I don't think it has to do more like with committee editing, but with just the presence, a much stronger presence of an editor, and perhaps with like a clearer set of rules about what goes and what doesn't. And yeah, that
I
figure is
actually
mostly
think you have a
absent.
lot more room to move in terms of the publishing world in English than you do in Spanish. And there's an alternative, publishing universe that exists in English that does not really exist in Spanish with any kind of large distribution, in part because there's lousy distribution in Latin America. I mean, you can go to Buenos Aires and see all kinds of books that when you cross over to Montevideo, literally like spitting distance away, and it's like, I'm sorry, do you know this writer? They don't even know because they haven't seen that book.
Thank you all for coming.